This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. The build-up to a war is always a fascinating series of events, because wars and conflicts very rarely ever just happen. In fact, in almost every situation, there's actually a slow building tempo from both sides, with the drums just getting louder and louder as both sides attempt to play over the other. And here in Venezuela, these drums have been building up for a long time between themselves and their much smaller neighbor, Guyana, as both countries disagree on where their borders lie. As things stand, Guyana is operating off the old British borders, whilst Venezuela operates off the pre-1899 borders, with Venezuela making a claim to nearly the entire western half of Guyana's recognized territory. A thickly jungled area of Guyana as large as the entire nation of Greece, whilst having a population so small it could almost fit within a single US stadium. But again, this was an 1899 dispute. But then the drums started to beat. And in 2007, Venezuela began protesting against Guyana as they started to carry out oil exploration in the disputed maritime area, but still the tempo was slow. But then things start to pick up. In 2015, ExxonMobil announces a significant oil discovery in these disputed waters off Guyana, that discovery being approximately 11 billion barrels worth of oil. So of course, Venezuela begins to issue decrees, reasserting its own maritime claims over those new deposits of oil. In 2016, the Guyanese would try to bring this all to a head, pushing the case to the International Court of Justice. But all it did was push the Venezuelans to escalate further. And by March 2019, Venezuela began openly threatening Guyana over the use of these oil wells, now openly broadcasting the fact that Venezuelan naval personnel were now getting underwater demolition tactic training from their counterparts in southern Iran. And by September, the Venezuelan Air Force would begin regularly violating Guyanese airspace. By 2020, the drums sped up again, with even more exercises being conducted near the Guyanese border. Venezuelan naval vessels now being reported just several miles from where Guyana was carrying out oil exploration activities, and forcing ExxonMobil to temporarily suspend some of their operations due to safety concerns. By 2021, the drums speed up again, and Nicolas Maduro issues a decree creating a new maritime territory, now going as far as to assert these claims, arresting Guyanese fishermen fishing inside Guyanese waters. By 2022, the drums became loud enough for everyone else to start noticing, with more exercises, more violations, more arrests, and reports emerging of Venezuela's military buildup along the border, now including tanks, torpedo boats, and newly created jungle warfare units. Guyana at this point would attempt to strengthen its military presence in response, but when push comes to shove, the Guyanese military is outnumbered 78-1. By 2023, Venezuela is now completely mask off, even giving their military exercises carrying out jungle incursion activities the subtle name of Essequibo is ours. Venezuela would keep moving more planes, more tanks, more torpedo boats, all further toward its eastern bases, and more tense standoffs would ensue in the waters of Essequibo. And this is where the conflict begins to spiral, with the ICJ ruling in favor of Guyana, and for reasons we'll get into later, Venezuela decides to ignore this and double down, now even going as far as to hold a national referendum on whether Venezuela should disregard the ICJ's findings and officially make moves to annex Essequibo. The result of their referendum only emboldening the Venezuelan government, with 98% of voters voting in favor of Venezuela pursuing these aims. And at this point, other players start getting involved as well, with the US, UK, Brazil, China, Russia, Iran all beginning to start taking sides, with some of these guys even moving their own air, naval, or land forces up towards these potential theaters of combat. And the tempo keeps rising, with more US State Department and intelligence officials making frequent trips to Guyana. And by December 7th of 2023, a Guyanese helicopter comes crashing down over the border. Now it's at this point that some people would attempt de-escalation, and whilst Maduro would reel back some of his own rhetoric on this one, and the international press would largely view this as de-escalation, other forces within the Venezuelan system kept the tempo going. And now we come toward the election, and Maduro has the bright idea to use Essequibo as a way to wedge the opposition, and rally more nationalist Venezuelans toward his party. But instead of backing down, the opposition would begin banging the drums themselves, cheering on the new airfields being built in disputed Guyanese territory, cheering on the new Iranian torpedo boats being moved up to the eastern naval bases, or the new Chinese fighter planes being moved up to eastern airfields, with the words Essequibo is ours emblazoned down the side of them. Both Maduro, the military, and the opposition, rather than de-escalating the situation, were all now adding to the volume of the drum. And for those watching Venezuela closely, everyone began wondering what the end goal here might be. Those drums, as well as the question, becomes louder than ever before this week, as after this week's election, producing no definite result, and both sides claiming victory. Both the opposition, the government, and the military are all working to win the approval of a population that pretty much only agrees upon one thing. So where does this conflict go from here? Will one of these sides look to increase the tempo again? And how much actual bite is there behind these Venezuelan barks? Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to be answering here today. And to take us through how we got here and how each side is seeking to use the conflict, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Message received.
So Maduro is probably facing what may be one of his toughest electoral challenges yet for a number of reasons. In years past, his government has had the benefit of vast oil income, which they have very notoriously used for electoral purposes in terms of granting benefits to people in the slums in Venezuela and effectively win their votes. There's even been accusations in the past where they use food handouts as a way to coerce people to vote. But this year is quite different in the sense that the economy has contracted more than 70% during Maduro's 11 years in office.
Kejal Vyas is the regional correspondent in South America for the Wall Street Journal, covering political, military, and electoral affairs throughout Latin America. Kejal has been covering the instability inside Venezuela for many years now, reporting from both in and outside the country. But today, he joins us from Caracas. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
So this year, it's quite different because Maduro is facing very tough sanctions that have been applied in recent years by the U.S. as well as some of its allies who have really kind of tightened the noose around Venezuela's government for various accusations, electoral fraud, corruption, human rights abuses. And that's really limited Maduro's spending ability. And so it's very unusual for him, having inherited the government from Hugo Chavez, his predecessor and mentor, who kind of set the template for ruling using a combination of his charisma and also free spending on social programs and welfare programs.
So we've been watching Maduro beat the drums of war for a while now. And while Venezuela officially made its claim on the territory of Essequibo back in 1962, and it has been the official position of the Venezuelan government since then, things have only really started to reach this boiling point over the last decade or so, with everything coming to a head in December 2023, where Maduro would hold a referendum on whether Venezuela should offer all 125,000 citizens living in Essequibo Venezuelan citizenship, and whether the country should oppose Guyana's claim and move to officially annex Essequibo. Now, as big as this move was, we haven't seen tanks move into Guyanese territory as yet. So what's happened since then?
Maduro has already declared the Essequibo Venezuela's newest state, and he's assigned military officials to start administering this territory, start handing out national ID cards to the 100,000 or so residents that live in this mostly jungle-covered area. I mean, it's very, very sparsely populated. And so it seems like he's trying to do something that would seem about as serious as you can without actually having huge consequences, because there's just not populations out there that they may not even notice. I often hear that there was a Venezuelan military incursion that went into the Essequibo, and once in a while we'll see the Guyanese government denounce these as like infringements on their sovereignty. But these areas are so unmonitored and so remote that it's kind of like if a tree falls and nobody hears it. It's one of these things where people may not even notice that this may be going on. So a lot of people have seen this as Maduro keeping a wild card in his back pocket.
Now, the referendum on whether Venezuela should reject the International Criminal Court's ruling and simply just push ahead with the annexation was a bit of a mixed bag. As whilst a whopping 98% of respondents voted yes, only about 51% of the country actually turned out to vote, which would usually be pretty dismal, but is still more than the 45% of the country that turned out to vote in 2018. But I want to get a better idea on how this impacts domestic politics. So across the political spectrum, when we look at the opposition, how popular is this concept? Are the opposition also backing an annexation of Essequibo?
Roughly about a decade ago, there were trips made out by Venezuelan opposition lawmakers to mostly kind of do slightly PR stunts where they would travel out to these remote areas that were in the Essequibo and they would plant a Venezuelan flag. It was done by many opposition politicians, including Maria Corina Machado, who is the most prominent opposition politician in Venezuela at the moment. So there's a very long track record of them making the argument that the Maduro government and the government under his predecessor Chavez did not do enough to secure this land on which they have a historical claim. And it was a sore spot.
So what has Maduro actually been physically doing in preparation for this annexation?
It seems to be a very clear show of strength, that they're serious about it, that they're actually doing something about reclaiming the Essequibo. Their movements have been fairly limited so far. They are constructing a base and a commando operational center on this island called Anacoco, which sits on in the middle of a river that divides the internationally recognized Venezuelan border and the Guyanese border, and specifically the Essequibo. They've also moved some other warships up near Venezuela's easternmost port city, which is called Guidia. And we've seen them move some anti-air missile carriers as well over there. Now, are those pieces alone enough to conquer a territory that's about the size of the U.S. state of Georgia or Louisiana? Probably not. But it is definitely seems to be a display that they're serious this time about taking the Essequibo back.
And we'll be talking a lot more about the military buildups and maneuvers a bit later on. But for now, I want to kind of stick with the motivations here. What's driving the tempo of this dispute? As one of the big claims I see all over YouTube at the moment is that this conflict is really just about oil, particularly the oil offshore in the territorial waters of Essequibo. As just within those waters off Essequibo, particularly in the Starbrug block, there is an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil, with 35 discoveries having been made in just the last few years. So with this massive pot of oil right there, how much do you think the oil was the driver on this conflict?
So it's very hard to make a case that Venezuela is trying to actually seize natural resources which are available in this disputed Essequibo territory. Because just on the surface, Guyana's proven oil reserves, we're talking about 11 billion barrels, something like that. Venezuela has 300 billion barrels. It doesn't feel like it's an effort to actually get resources that they need. It seems very apparent that it's an effort to strum up nationalist support. The Essequibo issue is something that actually crosses political lines in Venezuela. It's one of the few issues, actually, that has support across the political spectrum, in the sense that opposition people in Venezuela, as well as government support, both feel that the Essequibo is historically theirs, that they were cheated by colonial powers, and that it's up to them to eventually reclaim it.
Which brings me to the next claim I hear all the time. Well, of course, the opposition backed the annexation of Essequibo because Maduro passed a law a few years ago that would make anyone who doesn't support Venezuela's claim on the Guyanese territory ineligible to run for the presidency. But let's say if Maduro hadn't put that rule into place, do you think the opposition would still support the annexation of Essequibo?
I've never gotten the sense that Maduro making these requirements, of placing these kind of requirements that opposition politicians need to support the claim on the Essequibo is necessary for them to be a party or be a candidate or anything like that, because they've been talking about this for much longer than this election cycle.
Well, as we know, with great oil comes great compatibility. And Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, has been enjoying much closer relationships with both China, the US, the United Kingdom, and Brazil since the majority of their oil went into production in 2015. But to start with the US here, how would you describe the relationship between Guyana and the US at the moment?
One of the interesting things that's transpired over the last couple of years, especially since the growth of Guyana's oil industry, is that the country has become a much stronger strategic partner with the U.S. The U.S. actually has a pretty complicated history with Guyana, because during the Cold War, they actually had, this is all publicly available in declassified CIA documents, that the Americans worked to favor one party, which was the Afro-Guyanese party in Guyana, and to undermine the Indo-Guyanese party, which had leftist tendencies and was friendly with the government of Fidel Castro in that time. And so that's always left kind of a bitter taste in a lot of Guyanese mouths over the decades. But with the rise of the oil industry, we've seen both countries kind of turn a page to a certain extent. We've seen a lot of big American oil companies. Obviously, Exxon is the most emblematic in operating in Guyana. And that has also opened the way for new military and defense arrangements between Guyana and Washington. And so over the last several months, especially since the last quarter of 2023, we've seen streams of representatives from the U.S., the highest echelons of the U.S. government, from the State Department. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, visited. We've seen numerous military officials, numerous of high-ranking figures of the Department of Defense visit Guyana to ensure that they have their back in the case that Venezuela were to make some kind of military move on the Essequibo. And they've also been conducting military exercises, flyovers, and also they're contributing quite a lot of funds to beef up Guyana's defense forces. Now, Guyana is a country of less than 800,000 people. They have about 3,000 actual service men and women. They don't have a navy. They have a very small coast guard. It's not a country that has a particularly strong military might. And so they are really counting on support from the U.S. primarily, but also their former colonial master in the U.K., which has also sent over some survey ships, especially some counter-narcotics ships, to position themselves in Guyanese waters and to show that they have international partners and perhaps deter any movement from Venezuela.
Well, the other obvious big player here is Brazil. As within South America, Brazil is an absolute giant, making up around 50% of all of South America's population, about 53% of South America's GDP, and about 44% of South America's entire defense spending. And on top of all that, Brazil also shares a border with both Venezuela and Guyana. In fact, right now, the only roads traveling from Venezuela into Guyana actually detour through northern Brazil. So Brazil is really right on the front lines of this conflict, making it important to ask, how are they reacting to all this?
Brazil's in a very interesting position on this territorial dispute because they share a border with both countries, obviously on top of the Essequibo. And they have good relations, broadly speaking, with both countries. Under President Lula in Brazil, he's been a longtime supporter of Maduro. In the last election, he'd even done a campaign video for him supporting his reelection. At the same time, the Brazilians have been very keen on tapping economic opportunities for themselves that are emerging thanks to Guyana's economic growth and development, mostly due to the surging oil business in that country. There is a Brazilian construction company, for example, that has been carving the first ever paved road that connects the southernmost Guyanese city of Lethem up to another intermediary city called Linden. And this would be like the first paved road that's ever even existed there. And we've heard from many people in Guyana that the broad plan here is that they want to build a strategic roadway that can bring natural resources, not just from Guyana up to the Guyanese ports and then exported from there, but also serve as an important throughway for northern Brazil. Because at the moment, for logging companies, mining companies, there is a logistical challenge in that northern Brazil does not have any ports. And so cutting through the Essequibo reduces transport time and costs significantly. And so you do see that the Brazilians are looking to tap economic opportunities there. And so they have potentially a lot to lose if there is a armed conflict or some kind of conflict that upends their business aspirations.
And what about China? From what we understand, China has interests in both countries as well.
They seem to have potentially the most to lose, in the sense that they have deep ties in Venezuela. Out of all the countries in Latin America, Venezuela was the recipient of the most development loans, around $60 billion in loans that came from Beijing starting from 2006. And so they're heavily invested in Venezuela, both commercially and also have offered their support in terms of seeing Maduro as a legitimate leader at a time when the U.S. and many Western countries said he was illegitimate for rigging his elections and for corruption, rights abuses. So there's no doubt that they have supported Maduro, but they're also huge players on the Guyanese side. They're a partner with Exxon in the main offshore project that's been ramping up production over the last handful of years. And Chinese companies are fully embedded in the Guyanese economy. I mean, they're building lots of infrastructure. They're building a new bridge that's going to be vital for Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. They export lots of products, clothes, and all that stuff to Guyana. And they're also heavily involved in lumber. And so they do have quite a lot to lose there if there were to be some kind of conflict in both sides. And so while they've said little publicly on this issue, one gets the sense that behind the scenes, they either working diplomatic channels or may even have some assurances that this rhetoric won't go beyond rhetoric and will not escalate to an actual conflict, because both countries need China. Or have at least made an effort to have a closeness with China. And that would be potentially jeopardized if there were to be an armed conflict.
Now, as of the time of recording, events around the Venezuelan 2024 presidential election are still a little bit up in the air. As contrary to what the exit polls were suggesting, Maduro has claimed victory inside Venezuela, reportedly winning about 51.2% of the vote. Now, so far, some nations are calling the win fraudulent, whilst others like China and Nicaragua have called Maduro to wish him congratulations. Now, it's no secret that the opposition are probably a little bit closer to the United States than they are with China, but had they outright won the election and been coming into power tomorrow, do you think we would have seen the same level of Chinese interest in Venezuela without Maduro sitting there at the helm?
There is almost no doubt that the relationship with China would change, the relationship with Russia would change, the relationship with Iran, because the opposition in Venezuela there's no secret, they have wanted to reestablish and fortify relations with the U.S. once again. For many years, the U.S. has been the biggest supplier of Venezuelan oil. They also pay in cash. And so it's been a big economic benefit to the Venezuelan government's pocketbooks. China, on the other hand, has been signing lots of debt for oil agreements. So that's been mostly the model that they've used over the last nearly 2 decades. And so there's no question that many economists and especially opposition political leaders see a relationship with the U.S. as more beneficial to them and as a tool to somewhat restore some transparency. One of the big complaints of the deals that were inked with Beijing over the years is that many of the deals were kept secret. They were never published. The terms of those contracts were not very well known. And so it was very hard for anyone, economists, analysts, you name it, to actually try to make sense of Venezuela's financial books. So that's always been a massive variable. And that is something that the opposition has talked about undoing. They want transparency. They want to reinstore institutions. They want to reinstore public accounting. In the event that the opposition does take over, you can rest assured that this would certainly raise nerves in Beijing.
So while it's probably still too early to say for sure what exactly happened inside the Venezuelan election, the campaign as a whole has certainly had a number of twists and turns. And whilst understandably most outsiders would look at Venezuela and look at Maduro and assume that the candidate who'd wiped 3/4 of the country's GDP off of the map during his tenure and had a huge amount of very vocal anger toward him had absolutely no chance of winning the election, Maduro has also been preparing for this campaign for quite a long time, placing increasingly larger and larger thumbs on the scale for the opposition to have to overcome. So to set up some of the basics here, can you take us through some of the factors that would have played to Maduro's advantage coming into this election?
There are numerous reasons for calling this a rigged or heavily manipulated election, in the sense that they've banned opposition candidates and parties. There's been numerous political prisoners who've been locked up. There's also about 20 to 25% of the electorate is outside the country. Actually, there's about 8 million migrants who left under Maduro's rule due to the country's economic collapse. And less than 1% of those people are going to be able to cast a ballot.
This is just one of the ways that Maduro has managed to have massive influence on this election, way before even a single vote was ever cast. He's done so by doing things like cutting down the amount of consular staff at any of Venezuela's embassies across the globe, calculating that the 4 to 5 million Venezuelans who've fled the country are also 4 to 5 million people who are likely to vote against him. After all, if they liked Maduro, they probably would have stayed, and making it so that less than 1% of those voters who were eligible to vote can actually cast ballots in this election. Well, that just quickly removed 4 million votes that were very likely to go against him. He's also done things like allowing some smaller candidates to flourish as well, diluting the amount of anti-Maduro voters out there and splitting their vote across a whole bunch of candidates, in the end looking like it cost about 4 to 5% of the electorate. Then on top of that, making it illegal for one of the very popular previous candidates to run in the election. And at the last moment, forcing the opposition party to sub in a brand new candidate. One who frankly wasn't as charismatic as the previous leader, and one that even 2 days before the election, polls were showing that 15% of the country had no idea who they were. Now, there has been a lot of questions about the source of those exit polls that were suggesting the opposition got 60%. But let's say it had been such a clear-cut election result. Do you think Maduro would have been willing to step aside had the election been a clean-cut victory for the opposition?
It seems difficult to envision a scenario where Maduro would voluntarily relinquish power, especially considering that he today controls all the arms, controls most of the money in the country, has control over all the institutions. It's hard to see how he would give all that up and then subject himself to what could come afterwards, which would be potential, brought up on charges in Venezuela or being handed over to the U.S., where he has a $15 or $20 million bounty on his head for narco-terrorism charges. And he's also facing an investigation at the International Court of Justice at The Hague for crimes against humanity. And so why he would subject himself to all those things when he can technically avoid them is hard to imagine. So it seems very clear. We hear this from Western diplomats, from political scientists, that potentially one of the biggest players here is how the Venezuelan military would respond in the case that there was blatant electoral fraud and that there was exposed. We've heard some people speculate that Maduro cannot depend on the support of the armed forces. He has to be cautious about how he handles this election. However, I see very little evidence that the Venezuelan military is willing to turn on him or even hold him responsible. They've been by his side all these years through the previous allegedly rigged vote and ever since. And Maduro over the years has also increasingly militarized his government's rule. So you've seen lots of military officials open up private companies that win contracts from the government for everything from imports to oil field services and management. There's many former military officials who've gotten positions like oil minister or food minister. So they are very embedded into the government structure here. Now, there's no doubt a lot of discontent in especially the lower ranks of the military. Many of them are suffering from the same problems that the average Venezuelans are, people who were grappling with high inflation, watching the value of their money deteriorate, food shortages, all those things. They, of course, affect low-ranking military officials and their families, no doubt. However, for many of these young Venezuelan servicemen and women, they only know military life. And so for them to give up the one institution that has had their back, so to speak, or has kind of supported them over the years is also kind of difficult. It's a very controlled environment. In the past, there's also been advisors from Cuba who have helped keep the reins on the barracks, and they make sure that there is not dissent from inside. And so they've had it pretty well under control. And I would also just add that about 5 years ago, in early 2019, the U.S. made a huge gamble on supporting a opposition-led parallel government, which they deemed as the legitimate government. And part of that gamble by the U.S. was predicated on promises by the opposition that they were going to flip people in the Venezuelan military and that these guys were going to rise up and say no more and take Maduro out. It did not happen. It led to lots of protests in the streets. The National Guard, the military came out, put down those protesters, oftentimes violently. There was hundreds of deaths over multiple years. And so that experience, I think, has also kind of left a lot of people really jaded, very, very kind of resigned to the fact that the military is not on our side. I'm talking about average Venezuelans, and not just the diehard opposition folks, but just average Venezuelans who do want a change of government. I've actually been doing some interviews over the last few days in the slums around here, and you do hear this opinion pretty commonly. People say, it would be great if, like Pinochet or other strong men who have ruled around the world, who really only step down once a deal has been made and somebody from the military says, okay, it's time to go. I would also add one more thing, which is that many of these military folks also face U.S. sanctions, also face charges of corruption, charges of human rights abuses, torturing political prisoners. So they also face potential criminal charges under an opposition government. And so without some kind of clear amnesty offer and a credible amnesty offer, it's hard to see why they would suddenly turn their back on the guy who has handed them control of the economy.
So how did the military and the government find themselves in this position? A position where no one really trusts the democratic process here in Venezuela. That depending on who you talk to on the ground, you get completely different answers on how they view this election. And what we have, and seemingly what we have now, is one side claiming the vote was rigged, whilst the other side claims the opposition is nothing more than a sock puppet for the United States. So where does the military sit in all this? The military has been given increasing powers within society over the last few years, with Essequibo being the supercharge they needed. So what will this new, more powerful military do in this moment of transition? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Passenger or pilot?
What many Venezuelans would say in a very frustrated tone of voice is like there's no before and after sanctions. The sanctions started in 2018, and the crisis has been getting really bad since 2014, and maybe the peak was 2017. It is not the sanctions that are the problem.
Gisela Salim-Peyer is a Venezuelan journalist and the assistant editor at The Atlantic magazine, who's been writing on global affairs and regional politics, as well as the situation in her own home country for many years now. So we're thrilled to have her on the program today.
So since 2013, when Chavez died, there have been 2 presidential elections. The 2013 elections, which were Maduro versus Capriles, Capriles being the opposition candidate and Maduro being Chavez's handpicked successor. In the 2013 elections, Chavez had just died, and in 2013, the opposition still did not have the support that it has now, because all the worst things of the crisis, we're talking about a diaspora of 7 to 8 million people that left because of the humanitarian crisis. We're talking about, the worst years of scarcity. We're talking about going to the Amazon to mine gold because they could not get jobs in the city. All of those things happened after the 2013 election, and then they did not have the chance to capitalize on this suffering on the 2018 election. So this is really the first time it's obvious that the opposition would win if they would be counted fairly and the government would recognize the results.
So, to put it mildly, the election results have thrown a lot of things up in the air, and it's increasingly looking like the military will have the power card to play here, with units like the Bolivarian Guard playing a particular importance within this role, this being a branch of the military largely established, nurtured, and bolstered for its political alignment with Chavez and Maduro. But even while the militaries are the guys with the guns, a lot of the military's backing and support will come from how the public perceives them. So can you take us through how the public usually perceives the military and how the opposition has tended to work with the military too?
This is one of the biggest questions that people have, that academics and journalists have. And it's not just Maduro that was very cozy with the military. It was Chavez who started being very close to the military. The military has a privileged position with respect to the rest of the population in that everyone is struggling to buy food and everything. But if you're like a low-ranking military, you can set up a post in the highway and then people have to bribe you money if they want to come through. So the military has it better than the rest of the population, and the military would have a lot to lose. It's really a question what the military would do if there was an election and the government doesn't respect the results. I think the Maria Corina Machado, who is an opposition leader, she's not the candidate that is running because she was inhabilitated, but she's the leader of the opposition. She had a speech in which she said, "We need the military. The military is a good thing." And I think she was trying to hint at that if she became president, she was not going to do a witch hunt against military leaders, which is a different strategy that other opposition candidates have had. Juan Guaido, which was another opposition leader a few years ago. He tried to negotiate with the military and found it very hard.
Now, we have a full piece on Venezuela and its changing relationship with the United States back in episode 88. So if you want a full rundown and deep dive on that subject, you can always go back and check that out afterwards. But for now, as a very quick summary of the US and Venezuela's relationship, I'm going to wildly oversimplify the last couple of decades here. Now, in summary, the relationship between the two countries had been pretty good right up until Chavez came into power, as Chavez aligned more closely with Russia, Cuba, Iran, and Nicaragua. Now, Chavez would come to power in 1999, and the US would end up imposing sanctions upon the country in 2006. Now, while relations became a little bit better between the two countries under the Obama administration, things would nosedive later on under the Trump administration, where Trump would rapidly expand the scope of sanctions on a country that was already in significant trouble due to rampant domestic and governmental mismanagement. More importantly, though, these sanctions put in by the Trump administration would include financial sanctions against key government officials and entities and include the state oil company PDVSA, or PDVSA. The Trump administration had opted for a policy of maximum pressure, hoping to collapse the Venezuelan government from within. And it was during this period that Venezuelans reached the peak of their crisis, back in about 2017-2018. So it probably doesn't surprise anyone that this was also the period where the majority of those 4 to 8 million Venezuelans would flee the country into Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, and actually quite often into the United States. Now, during the 2018 election, the last time the Venezuelans went to the polls to vote for president, the US did attempt to influence that outcome by supporting opposition efforts to delegitimize or boycott the election, with the US also pushing for international condemnation of the election process, even urging bodies like the Organization of American States to expel Venezuela for their actions. At the heart of the crisis, the US allegedly began moving PMCs into Colombia and positioning them on the border with Venezuela, giving their full-throated support to opposition leader Juan Guaido. So much support that Guaido would even be invited to address Congress just a few years later. But with all of his open US support, it became very easy for the Maduro administration to paint him as, frankly, a US puppet, running major advertising campaigns of Guaido openly supporting the US sanctions against Venezuela, openly supporting the same US sanctions that were causing major problems inside Venezuela. And whilst Juan Guaido had enjoyed a 61% approval rate at one point, this would later drop down to just 16% approval rating, with Maduro also trying to paint all of the opposition parties under this same brush, many of whom weren't nearly as close with the US administration and instead just wanted to fix some of the economic damage that had been done to the country. But Trump would leave office and Biden would come in. And under the Biden administration, the US would take a very different tack with Venezuela. The US's relations toward Venezuela would focus much more on things like building up the economy, supporting democratic institutions, and beginning to address the humanitarian crisis within the country, with the Biden administration also being much more targeted with their sanctions on the Maduro regime rather than the Venezuelan public as a whole, and engaging in much more diplomatic efforts with both the government and the opposition. Now, the Biden White House had two reasons for doing so. The first being US domestic immigration, as the Biden administration saw the huge amount of Venezuelans that were attempting to migrate out of Venezuela and into the US. So calculated that if they made life better for Venezuelans inside Venezuela, they'd have less incentive to travel to the United States, and more incentive to stay in their home countries, with the second aim of the Biden administration being to enlarge Venezuela's position within the global oil markets and help counterbalance Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, particularly after the Saudis had lowered their oil output before the US midterm elections. The future plan here being that even if the Saudis or Russians attempted to lower their oil output, the US could use Venezuela to add more oil into the market and better stabilize the price. And so the Biden administration would release a lot of the sanctions upon the Venezuelan oil markets, with the US oil giant Chevron, the Spanish firm Repsol, and the Italian firm Eni being allowed to resume work with the Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA, the group together beginning to ramp up oil production. Now, as production increased, living standards continued to improve inside Venezuela, and as predicted, the number of migrants leaving Venezuela continued to drop, and the Venezuelans began to make up a larger share of the global oil export market. But all of this goodwill and relaxation of sanctions was predicated on Venezuela genuinely building democratic institutions and preparing for a truly democratic election in 2024. So after the Maduro government reneged on these promises and barred key opposition leaders from running in the election, the United States would reimpose these sanctions back in April of this year. However, the reintroduction of sanctions came after things had become increasingly frosty between the United States and Caracas, with the referendum on whether the country should annex Essequibo being a particularly bad moment in relations between the two countries. So Gisela, why would Maduro call a referendum on a topic as contentious as an invasion of Guyana, a country who they know is becoming increasingly important to the United States?
The government wanted to understand how much of its electorate it could mobilize, and that's why they had the referendum. Like, they wanted to see how many votes they could get in preparation for the election. So the referendum was not a serious thing. It was more related to the coming election than a serious plan to invade Guyana. The reason why they think this is because in Venezuela, the Guyana issue is not really opposition versus government. That's just something that many Venezuelans feel strongly about, regardless of their political affiliations.
In that case, did the majority of the population think the government would attempt, or maybe will attempt, an invasion of Guyana in the future, though?
We are used to not taking our government very seriously when they say they're going to do something. So I think most Venezuelans, journalists and academics that I spoke with, they saw this as something that the government was doing for other reasons. They think more related to the coming election than a serious intention to do this.
If the government did hypothetically choose to go for an invasion, though, how do you think the public would likely feel about it?
When I spoke to many lawyers and experts on the Guyana issue that were Venezuelan, they were very upset about the way the government was pursuing this Guyana. They were saying, I do not support a military invasion, but our claim to Guyana is legitimate, and I think Venezuela should do a better job at pursuing it at the International Court of Justice in Den Haag. The cause of Guyana is very dear to Venezuela. What I mean is that the idea that the Essequibo is ours is just something that Venezuelans are taught in school. And the Essequibo has not been part of Venezuela effectively for more than 100 years. I mean, the people there speak English, play cricket. Nobody there thinks themselves Venezuelans, and Venezuelans don't care about that. They don't even know very well what the Essequibo looks like. But this idea that it's ours and that the Venezuelan sun rises in the Essequibo, as a slogan puts it, is very important. But if everything stayed the same, so if there was this status quo in which the Essequibo continues being effectively part of Guyana, but not officially, then I think Venezuelans would be perfectly happy with a status quo. So the way a journalist put it to me was, I don't think that Maduro cares a lot about Guyana. He just doesn't want to be the president that officially loses control.
So what would you say to the claim then that the pursuit of Essequibo is more about oil than pride, and that the annexation of this territory would be a good way to inject money into the economy? And that was the motivation driving Maduro to go down this road.
I don't think this is motivated by economics. Venezuela has plenty of oil. I mean, it's not well administered, but I don't think that they're after Guyana for the oil. And I think that's very much the narrative of the press, like they're going after Guyana's oil. I really think that this is as much about national pride as it is about resources. And again, Guyana represents the prosperous country that Venezuela lost its chance to be. It's now, I think, the fastest growing economy in the world, or one of. And Venezuela was once that in the 50s and 60s.
And how are people in Guyana viewing all of this? Do they think Maduro is bluffing, or are they concerned there will be an attack from Venezuela?
So I spoke to academics and common people who live in the Essequibo, and I didn't get the impression that they were awfully concerned. They were like, yeah, this has been going on forever, and it has not affected my life at all. I'm not like going to the supermarket and buying supplies in case Venezuela invades Guyana. That's not what people are doing. But the country's leaders and very high up oil executives are really worried about this, because even if Venezuela doesn't go ahead and invade Guyana, the fact that there is this threat makes politics very difficult. A lot of oil conglomerates are not going all in with their investments because technically this is a disputed land, and that makes it way riskier. The World Bank was once going to finance a giant hydroelectric project in Essequibo, but they received an ominous letter from Venezuela, so they decided to walk back. So, there are many ways in which, even if Venezuela doesn't pursue an outright invasion, this just makes everything more difficult.
So, for Caracas, both sides of politics support the seizing of Essequibo, and the military has been given increased funding, power, and motivation to do so. And now, with the generals becoming more gung-ho about an invasion of the country, and the oil companies already showing they're financially nervous about it, could an attack on Guyana actually become feasible? Could Venezuela and its 36-to-1 ratio of soldiers compared to Guyana really annex Essequibo against Guyana's will? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. Never let a crisis go to waste.
They still have a ton of problems. It's similar to the impact of corruption on the military in Russia. The Russian military looked pretty tough up until the day that they invaded Ukraine, and then you suddenly decided that all of the money that generals had skimmed off and not having spare tires and maintaining engines, suddenly you had lots of things that were breaking down and lots of people that were supposed to be smart but didn't know what to do.
Evan Ellis is a professor of strategic studies, specializing in Latin America and the Caribbean for the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. He's also the author of an amazing Substack outlining the latest political and military events taking place within the region. However, prior to these roles, he also worked on the U.S. Secretary of State's policy planning staff with responsibilities for Latin America, the Caribbean, the international narcotics trade, and cross-border law enforcement matters. And so, we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
So little by little, they started making things better, especially as they got into the contested political situation in 2019, 2020. And so that was when you had the Russians coming over and sending teams to try to help get their air defense systems, the S-300s, back online, get the operational availability of the Sukhois up a little bit.
Now, on paper, when you put the Venezuelan military up against the Guyanese military, it really is chalk and cheese. And somewhat understandable why. Venezuela has about 39 times the population of Guyana and 78 times the amount of troops once you start including paramilitary forces. With Caracas currently in command of around 63,000 soldiers in the army, 25,000 soldiers in the navy, 12,000 soldiers in the air force, and around 220,000 across all its paramilitary forces, including things like the National Guard and the Bolivarian militia. And that number is just what they officially state they have at the moment, as back in 2018, Maduro would claim that under pressure, Venezuela could press 1.8 million soldiers into service. Although at 1.8 million, I'd be questioning whether they actually have enough guns to go around. But they obviously have the advantage when it comes to quantity, but what about quality? How would you categorize the overall readiness of the Venezuelan military, and are they ready for a war at the moment?
You've seen that in Venezuela to a certain degree. For example, about 10 years ago when they tried to move forces to the Colombia-Venezuelan border, and they had a difficult time just getting across that terrain and coordinating the logistics for doing that. And so although there are specific systems that they've made an effort to get back up in shape against some of the air defense systems, one suspects and one gets the feeling that the overall level of readiness is really pretty low. And if you had any type of large-scale deployment of infantry units and armored units to try to actually occupy, expose some of those deep problems with lack of training budgets, lack of maintenance budgets, lack of training, equipment that's not been properly maintained, and things like that, as well as some command and control tensions, which are hidden when you're just staying in the barracks and the commander taking their payoff from the narco money that goes through. But when you actually get out in the field and you have to do something, I think some of those inadequacies, and frankly also some of the difficulties that go into the politicization of the command system, and the fact that you have loyalty for now more than a decade being the basis for rewards rather than actual competency. Frankly, the accumulation of over 2,000 generals in the Venezuelan armed forces. And so the level of command experience that you would expect to have with field-grade officers probably is also not there. And so some things look good. Some things have gotten better, but there are some serious difficulties that would be exposed if they ever tried to actually deploy into the Essequibo. And they know that, and Maduro knows that.
So, as a part of this program, myself and the team spent a lot of time analyzing the military structures and developments of a whole bunch of different national militaries, giving us a fairly good idea on what an average military looks like, and then where some militaries tend to deviate from the normal. And one of the oddities we came across when looking at the Venezuelan military was the absolute litany of air defense assets these guys have available to them. With Caracas currently operating Russian S-300s, modernized Russian S-125s, Russian Buk M2s, some Israeli Barak 1s loaded with French missiles, a whole boatload of Soviet-made Zu-23s, and a frankly unfathomable amount of shoulder-fired anti-air weapons. So what I want to ask you is why they've chosen to develop their military around this. Why they put such an emphasis on something like air defense over the comparative lack of things like, for example, submarines, which currently the Venezuelan Navy only operates 2 submarines, both of which were built in Germany in the late 1970s, and both of which haven't been observed at sea for quite a while now. So what is driving Caracas' decision to place all their eggs in the air defense basket?
Well, certainly the priorities have changed over time, and they do not have a requirements-based rational planning system. What you had in the early years is essentially trying to move away from a relatively effective combined arms force that the U.S. had helped them to build up to essentially replacing those high-tech goodies that the generals liked with their Russian equivalents. And so that was when you had the $11 billion in acquisition of the Sukhoi fighters and the BMPs and the BTRs and the T-72 tanks and the air defense munitions and things like that. And so a lot of hardware that made the military happy but didn't necessarily correspond to the mission, especially as they completely revived their style of combat and their doctrine to really focus on a protracted guerrilla warfare rather than something that would need armored units per se. So certainly the fact that they have put a certain amount of attention on air defense, they essentially don't want the gringos or others coming in with impunity and being able to just attack Caracas and do strategic airstrikes against Chavista leadership. For similar reasons, they want to maintain a certain capability in terms of a fighter aircraft. But I think overall, it's been pretty patchwork. It's reflected what individual units want to have rather than necessarily what they think their actual warfight scenario can be.
So from here, let's move over to the Guyanese military and get a better idea on what they're operating at the moment. Now, obviously, the Guyanese military is a much smaller force than that of the Venezuelans, with Guyana much more focused on things like border security, being much more focused on border security than they are on launching an expeditionary war. And at present, Georgetown is commanding somewhere around 3,000 in the Army, 200 in the Coast Guard, and about 200 in the Air Force, with about 670 in the paramilitary forces. And when it comes to their equipment, most of what Guyana is operating at the moment is either Cold War era or even World War II era armaments, with the Guyanese currently operating arms from the UK, the USSR, Brazil, China, the US, France, and Germany. And this wide array of military suppliers could be because Guyana has a lot of military partnerships, or could just be because these guys probably had the best stocked World War II museums for the Guyanese military to pilfer from. The Guyanese military are obviously quite underdeveloped at the moment, but how would you summarize the Guyanese military as a whole?
Well, so first of all, the Guyanese military is in the process of a rapid expansion of capabilities that's driven both by the Venezuelan threat and also being driven by these new responsibilities for these very productive oil-rich territories that obviously the Venezuelans want, but for a number of other reasons you need to protect against criminal activities and other things. And so to start kind of back from the beginning, in the old pre-oil days, the GDF, the Guyana Defense Force, was dramatically underfunded. Overall, still to this day, they still have, in terms of their military force, only about 3,400 people on active duty. They actually have a reserve, which goes back to their days of Soviet guerrilla-style doctrine, where they would have a people's militia that would come in to defend the Guyanese territory. But by and large, they had very little traditional capability. I mean, they really have no tanks. They have only a very small number of armored fighting vehicles. I think literally only 30 traditional, although aging armored fighting vehicles. They have a handful of boats for riverine capability. They have actually made a pretty significant increase in their number of patrol aircraft. So they now actually have about 24 helicopters and 24 fixed-wing aircraft, which is a lot better. But the reason that they've done that is because, again, in trying to protect their maritime area and the vast expanses, once they started getting some of that oil revenue, they needed and had a little bit of money to at least be able to get some eyes and ears up there. But again, these are not interceptor fighter aircraft. These are more surveillance type of aircraft. And so at the end of the day, I mean, what you're basically looking at is a Guyanese military that's still very, very small. Again, about 3,400 people versus about 130,000 active duty troops for the Venezuelan military. It is very, very light in any type of armored vehicles or force projecting capability or mobility capability. Venezuela has, again, something over 300 APCs and infantry fighting vehicles, which again is, more than a factor of 10 and far newer than what the Guyanese that you have. And so at the end of the day, the forces just don't compare.
Which definitely set the stage for the pretty widespread panic everybody was quibbling about back in December last year. As whilst the Guyanese military appears to be absolutely no match for the Venezuelans on paper, Venezuela also began undergoing a series of very provocative moves, where after the referendum, Caracas not only established a government and military command over Essequibo to be based from the eastern Venezuelan town of Tumarino, they also began moving more air assets and Iranian torpedo boats out to the northeasternmost naval base in Guyana. And on top of that, they also started developing a small base and military airstrip on the disputed Annexing Island, a small island that both Guyana and Venezuela claim that sits in the river between the two countries. And if all of that wasn't subtle enough, Venezuela would also begin its Essequibo Resolves exercises. But across all of these provocative moves, the one that most people seem to be attached to is the buildup on Annexing Island. But strategically, how big a deal is that?
We have to actually remember that, ironically, was Annexing Island that going all the way back into, I think it was 1966, at the time of Guyanese independence, that was actually what Venezuela started moving troops into when that dispute over Essequibo took place back then as well. And so it's a strategic location, but to go in any large quantity, you would need to have far more crossing than that, and you'd need to have the ability to both move and sustain. There actually are not a lot of roads, and depending on what time of year you're going in, it can be some pretty difficult terrain to operate armored vehicles, and especially to sustain armored vehicles. And so the indication clearly was they were getting ready to do something. And so they had the armored fighting vehicles. They had built a bridge, which loosely said, well, you could use that as a basis for moving not only those, but a bunch of others across that bridge at that one single point. And again, they had some naval gunboats there. You'd probably want to have a lot more gunboats if you wanted to do river operations. So the indication that they were thinking of doing something that really never led to the deployment of a larger force that actually would have been necessary to be threatening. But the other thing to keep in mind again is, and again, thinking of the lessons of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, to use that analogy, the ability to move across relatively hard terrain, at least when it's not the rainy season, in the case of Ukraine for Russian armor, that is a heck of a lot easier than moving through, sometimes soggy, soft jungle terrain without roads, with certain types of trees, depending on which part of the Essequibo you're moving through. So the real problem wouldn't be just to get vehicles in the territory, but how do you actually have sustained mobility? How do you actually protect them? How do you actually have coordinated movement? Because in some parts of the Essequibo, it would have been pretty difficult, maybe not to stop the first waves from going in, but once you get in, essentially to slice up their mobility by essentially focusing on critical road points and in bridges and things like that.
And see, this is where the story takes a turn. As whilst all of these airfields and buildups do sound fairly concerning, when you actually dig into it and start looking deeper, the situation becomes a whole lot more complicated. As whilst the Annexing Island's airstrip appears quite scary as you're scrolling down a Twitter feed, when you actually zoom out and take a closer look at the location, things appear quite different. As not only when we look up the satellite imagery from just a few days ago, the Bailey Bridge across the river has actually been retracted now, but the base has had very little work done to it since about April-May this year. More importantly though, is the actual location of Annexing Island. As if you were to imagine Guyana as roughly the shape of a cartoon chicken drumstick, Annexing would be on the left-hand side about halfway down where the chicken meets the bone, meaning that it's a very long way away from where Georgetown is, roughly about the top middle of the chicken drumstick. So if the Venezuelans were to use Annexing as a jumping off point to launch a company of tanks over the river and into Essequibo, they'd actually just be arriving into a jungle in the absolute middle of nowhere. In fact, the nearest population center, a small 300-person village known as Essequibo, is 102 kilometers away from where you cross the river. In fact, if you get across the river at Annexing, the nearest Guyanese road is just over 250 kilometers away. And once you get to that road, well, then it's only a 605 kilometer journey from there until you reach the outskirts of Georgetown. And to really drive my point home here, let's do some quick maths. Now, being such thick jungle here, let's assume our Venezuelan soldiers are more mobile and traveling on foot. And Caracas manages to establish a nice Bailey bridge for them to cross from Annexing into Essequibo. Now, this is very isolated, quite heavy jungle, meaning the distance our soldiers can travel per day could drop down to around 2 to 3 kilometers per day. Now, if those soldiers take absolutely no days off and don't come under any attacks by drones, helicopters, or snakes, the first Venezuelan soldiers should reach the first roads and onto the Guyanese road network by about day 87, which is great because they've only got another 20-day march from there until they reach Georgetown and can actually start fighting the war, suggesting that the Venezuelans want to bring vehicles into the battle with them. Now, in Guyana, there are no roads heading west from Georgetown toward Venezuela, which means the Venezuelans are going to have to make their own road. And to do another quick bit of maths, and just to do some quick calculations again, and basing the amount of road they can clear per day on roughly what the US engineers could do in Vietnam, which again I think is quite generous for the Venezuelans, to build just the necessary dirt road from Tumarino to Georgetown. If you started today, you'd arrive at the outskirts of the Guyanese capital in just 1,954 days, or around 5.5 years if you don't take any days off. Then again, that's under good conditions and also not coming under attack. So let's say they are crazy enough to do this though, that Venezuela is committed to reaching Georgetown at some point. So Evan, do the Venezuelan armed forces actually have the engineering capacity to carry out a task like this?
Sure. Well, first of all, when you say build a highway, the presumption is that you're talking a construction engineer, and so wouldn't be building a paved highway that we think of as a highway, but build some type of surface that is reinforced enough or heavy enough so that at the least tracked equipment can move along. And frankly, the problem is if you have one road that goes along the coast, it's pretty easy to cut that up and make it impassable if that's your objective from a defender's standpoint. And so to actually be defensible, you have to have multiple routes in. You have to be able to defend those routes against outside attack. And if you have others helping you to defend, such as the United States, then that becomes a really difficult problem. And even so, improving something, that goes to what degree do the Venezuelans actually have credible engineering vehicles? And that's one of those areas that the Venezuelans arguably have not spent money on because it's not very sexy, and commanders like to have tanks more than they like to have bulldozers. If there was an invasion, and again, that's Guyanese territory, they would be trying to use limited assets to do that really under fire, which again would create another impossibility.
In fact, from what it seems, the only real land avenue for the Venezuelans would be to travel to the southeast corner of Venezuela, cross into Brazilian territory for around 350 kilometers, with Brazil being a much larger military power and also significantly bolstering its garrisons near the stations along the road that Venezuela would have to use for this operation. How much does that complicate things for Venezuela here? And what do you think Brazil's likely response would be if Venezuela were to attempt an invasion like this?
As you recall, when there was that heightened threat of military action, one of the things that the Brazilians did is they deployed a battalion-sized unit there on the Brazilian border where Brazil meets both Venezuela and Guyana at Essequibo. And it's interesting, and it goes back to that whole question of logistics. The reason why they did that is that it would have been far more logical from where the established roads are for the Venezuelans to drive clear down to Brazil and then basically drive up into Guyana that way, rather than to try to drive across sometimes in jungle or scruff without roads. And so the Brazilians, wanting to make sure that their territory did not inadvertently become the source for a Venezuelan invasion into Guyana, basically they deployed what was essentially a blocking force there. And if the Venezuelans had done anything, they could have deployed a lot more forces before it became anything more than that. But that force was kind of a signal. The Brazilians were saying, you are not going to take this route through Brazilian territory into Guyana. So we're not getting involved, but we're going to shut off any option that would make Brazil complicit.
Okay, let's tick all the boxes here and talk about an amphibious landing then, as Georgetown sits right on the northern coast of Guyana. So if Venezuela were to say, stuff the jungle and let's bring a company of Venezuelan troops and land them on the coast at the edge of Georgetown, using all 3 of Venezuela's working landing craft. What do you think happens first? Those 150 Venezuelans end up winning the war against Guyana. They end up running out of bullets waiting for the boats to go back to Venezuela to get more ammo. All the Venezuelans are pretty quickly killed or arrested by the local police. What do you think is the most likely outcome for an amphibious invasion here?
Landing ships tend to be pretty vulnerable. So what we're talking about here, one would have to presume that you would have some amount of naval escort. And the Venezuelans just don't have the ships or other assets to be able to protect landing ships. And actually, Georgetown is actually pretty far away from the current actual border between Venezuela and Guyana's Essequibo. So without having to work out the exact distances or speeds or even the range of the landing ships that they would use, the amount of time it would take and the amount of escorts that you would take, it's hard to believe that if it was the Guyana Defense Force on their own, maybe there'd be a chance of it getting through. But given that any Venezuelan invasion of Guyana would almost certainly invoke actions by others, probably the US, probably the British, to defend, it would be pretty easy to sink a couple of Venezuelan landing ships with a handful of missiles or intercepting with a naval asset or any number of other ways before they ever got any place near Georgetown. And again, as you pointed out, a company full of the trained Venezuelan troops. I mean, I think the factions of criminals in Georgetown could take care of them before they ever had to deal with the population. And so that would probably not be a feasible way to project a threat. I mean, some of the only real maritime threats that I've seen, there's some rumors that the Venezuelan Navy has had some special forces training in underwater demolitions in Bandar Abbas by the Iranians, and of course has gotten some fast attack boats with some adapted Chinese missiles also from the Iranians. And so the concern is less an attack force than a force that could essentially sabotage Exxon oil platforms or other things if Exxon was not paying money demanded, effectively extortion to the Venezuelans. And so really, the capabilities that the Venezuelans have on the Navy side really is more towards doing damage to oil production as a way of getting partners like Exxon to pony up more than any type of force projection from the sea.
So when it comes to the Venezuelans, a full-on invasion of Essequibo seems pretty out of the range for now. But that doesn't mean the Venezuelans can't use this to saber rattle with Georgetown. Because even though most of the players here in the region know that Venezuela isn't able to physically invade Guyana, it doesn't mean they want to encourage Venezuela making bolder and bolder moves here in the region. So all sides here are attempting to play politics with the issue, which we saw the last time this flared up back in December, with the US, UK and Brazil using the incident to gain much closer ties with the Guyanese, and the Chinese using the incident to position themselves as the mediator in the conflict, providing medical supplies and financial assistance to the Guyanese, whilst also selling Hongdu Ka-8W light attack aircraft blazoned with the words "Essequibo is ours" down the side of them to the Venezuelans. So conflict-wise, what is China's ultimate aim here?
So if you look at China's posture, China has almost universally tried to stay out of explicit involvement in armed conflicts where it can be seen as being against the United States or supporting aggression. But in terms of actual overt, obvious support, that's something that even in Ukraine, China has stayed away from. And so with respect to China, what I suspect that you would see is that you would not have Chinese military support for any Venezuelan invasion, but you would probably have China continuing to purchase Venezuelan oil, at least kind of on the sly through KTIC as they do now, maybe through ship-to-ship transfers off of Malaysia, which is one of the ways that they've been doing it to avoid sanctions responsibility so far, or perhaps other types of Chinese support through loans and other engagement. And so largely, I think what you could expect from China, again, would be to at least not condemn Venezuela and provide some way that the China would actually make a lot of money off the deal while giving Venezuela grist to continue doing whatever they decided to do, just like they've done with Russia.
Well, speaking of Russia, we can see that there is a very close relationship between Moscow and Caracas, particularly when it comes to the two militaries, with Moscow providing the repairs for the Venezuelan Air Force and supplying everything from S-300s to T-72s, BTRs, BMPs, and a whole bunch of other weapon systems. And whilst we have seen Russian trainers and Wagner deployments inside the country, if you start perusing through certain corners of the internet, there are also suggestions that Russia operates two military bases out of Venezuela, although the sources behind them are pretty sketchy. So my two questions here are, what are Russia's overall aims here in Venezuela? And what do you think their response would be if Venezuela found themselves at war with Guyana?
In the case of Russia, it would be reasonable to expect something more explicit. So again, the Russians sent in Wagner personnel, as you know, to defend Nicolas Maduro back in 2009. They've sent in training teams. They've sent in teams to help fix the S-300 air defense systems, among other things. As you pointed out, there have been rumors that even as much as a week ago that a Russian plane, presumably carrying military personnel, went to help respond to some sort of Venezuelan election-related thing deploying into Venezuela. So it's not clear what the Russians are doing on the ground in Venezuela or not, whether they're just helping to maintain the readiness of systems, whether they're providing a protection force for Maduro. But it is plausible that in the context of a war, for example, if you had a war miraculously broke out now, of course, you have the new ships that just showed up in Havana Harbor, which would be in the vicinity. And of course, just last month, you had the frigate Gorshkov and the nuclear sub Kazan. And supposedly there are going to be more Russian assets that come later in the fall. And so just having Russian ships running around at a time would create some risk of interaction between U.S. and Russian, or perhaps Venezuelan military aircraft being flown by Russian pilots, which is one of the rumors which has occurred in the past. So it would elevate risks. It's possible that the Russians would involve themselves in some way in support, but I haven't seen yet where the Russians wanted to be so directly escalatory to say that we are going to fly explicitly Russian flagged vessels or Russian military equipment under Russian flag against U.S. equipment trying to attack the Venezuelans. So I think you'd see some support, far more than with the Chinese, but it would be a complicating factor and a risk factor, I think, more than it would be a kind of direct escalation. We're here to defend Venezuela.
Which I guess brings me to the major question for Caracas here. That being, what is the point in all this? As I hear some people saying that all of this Essequibo stuff is just an election stunt by Maduro, I hear some people suggest that this is just a way for Maduro to inflate the military's importance within society, something that unfortunately is now going to be very hard to retract, whilst there's also other groups that suggest that these actions in Essequibo are part of a wider compellence strategy by Caracas, that Venezuela hopes to use this as a way to ratchet tension up and down between themselves and Guyana, and that even if both sides know an invasion is physically impossible, both sides would feel massive political pressure to react in some way, with Venezuela able to up the pressure on Guyana and then release the pressure for a price. If we follow that same train of thought, there's also suggestions that this compellence strategy would be used against the oil companies operating out here in Essequibo's waters, hoping to either scare away additional producers and weaken some of the growth taking place in Guyana, or attempt to elicit extortion pay for the operators working out there. When looking at all these theories, what do you think is the master plan for Caracas here?
So for me right now, it's become a couple things. Number one, it's become a vehicle to be used against the opposition. Again, one of the early maneuvers was to try to tie members of the opposition a couple of months ago to a supposed treasonous plot to give away Essequibo. So it was a way to divide the opposition. Number two, I think it was a way to extort the oil companies, sending a signal to Exxon and Hess, or eventually Chevron, that if you don't pay us, then you're going to have problems. And Exxon clearly remembers, again, back with the first ship that was intercepted, the Technica Perdona, back in 2013, and then with the other incident against their seismic ship, the Ramform Teslas, there's an understanding that unarmed petroleum ships, if you have to deal with the Venezuelan Navy, it's better just not to drill. It's like when the guy from the ELN shows up in the Llanos of Colombia. You don't need to have a whole bunch of guys, but just enough armed guys who show up at the petroleum site to make you understand that you better pay up or you've got a problem. So it's partly electoral. It was partly extortion. I had some concerns that an escalation could have been used to avoid the elections, especially given that Maduro was 30 percentage points behind. But the real risk comes 3 or 4 weeks after things have calmed down a little bit, where again, you now need the money. It's pretty clear that you're back working with Gustavo Petro in Colombia. You're back working with Lula. All has been forgiven and forgotten. And now you want to go back to something that, again, divides the opposition, moves yourself forward, creates some momentum, creates some resources through a bit of extortion. And so maybe that's when you try to ratchet up something that could get you into an armed activity again. But only, I would say, after this critical election moment has passed. I certainly could be wrong, but one of the things, it's been my judgment over the years, is in the 25 years I've followed Venezuela, first in the private sector and now, I think one thing that Chavez did well, one thing that Maduro has done well, one thing that Jorge and Delcy Rodriguez and the rest of Chavismo has done, very, very well, is have a good instinct of how you manipulate the system to keep yourself in power and not do stupid things that could expose you to a coup or a division that could find yourself out of power.
So, should we be worried about a theoretical war between Venezuela and Guyana? Well, me, personally, I would argue yes. As whilst I still think we won't be seeing Venezuelan tanks rolling down the streets of Georgetown anytime soon, I would also argue that that line of thinking involves logical decision making. And as we've seen time and time again, when dictators are cornered, and their failure likely means facing an international court, that's when their thinking often isn't that logical. As things stand in the chaotic fallout from the election, all sides here are now being backed into a corner. As if Maduro was to have a change of heart, come out and say the vote was rigged and step aside, he knows that that would likely result in him facing trial and possible extradition to the United States. If the opposition gives up its claim on the election and simply steps aside, they're also likely aware that this may be the last chance democracy gets to remove Maduro peacefully. And if the military steps aside, well, they may be forced to give up some of those additional powers, commands, fundings, and influence that they've been acquiring over the course of this build-up toward Guyana. Even if Maduro's best-case scenario were to take place, the opposition steps aside, and Maduro is able to strike some sort of imbalanced deal with Guyana for offshore oil access. In the back of his mind, he still probably knows he can't de-escalate everything, and that now with these institutions like the Integral Defense Operations Zone, the one that manages Essequibo for the military, those kind of things can't be undone without either massive backlash from the public or backlash from the military themselves, meaning you have a command whose sole job is to escalate with Guyana, being the same command you can't really undo. So what may have started as an easy way to make sure the military would favour Maduro when the chips were down, or push the opposition into a wedge position, has now severely limited Maduro's options here around what to do with Essequibo. And while I'm sure he knows his armed forces probably aren't capable of carrying out such an invasion, at the same time, the fragmented and frankly corrupt military structure out here in the east of the country, as well as this newly created command, whose entire existence and pay relies on the situation escalating, has the power within its own hands to forcing the regime to do something it knows is a bad idea. It is still a balancing act though, and if Maduro can keep this contained, there is a chance he might be able to use the Essequibo situation to his advantage, extorting his way to protection money, making life difficult for the Guyanese administrations during elections, or even just deterring further investment and further American interest in the waters just off his coast. But the method of achieving this is almost the equivalent of a crazy man holding down the safety catch on a grenade. As yes, whilst that safety catch is being held on tightly, everything is relatively safe. But if that person fumbles, everything very quickly blows up in their face. And unfortunately, it's in these desperate moments, like the one unfolding around the election results as I record this, that leaders like Maduro are most prone to fumbling. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. What a nightmare this episode has been to put together. Now, I'm sure long-term listeners of the show already know this, but we usually don't do episodes that are dependent on the outcome of an election, as the production cycle on these pieces takes quite a long time. So we always try and avoid leaving these things to chance. But this month we tried something different, and we decided to roll those dice on both the South African election and the Venezuelan election. And in the end, both of those episodes forced us to choose between keeping a regular schedule or taking our time and carrying out massive rewrites and re-edits so we can make sure that what we're putting out is up to date and correct. And hopefully you understand why things have turned out the way they have. But thankfully for myself and the rest of the team, our next episode isn't reliant on any election. So hopefully there's no need to start re-editing big chunks of an episode. And if you want to find out what we're doing with our next episode, the best way to do so is by following all of our links and info on either Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok at the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeHilliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Mamaster, Scott Bavanus, Big Bob's Beepers, Metal Dragonair, Josh B, Daniel Crow, Dufdrash, and a very special thanks to Barnaby Brooking. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, whose donations help us keep this thing going. And if you feel you can spare a couple of dollars, and you want access to our full video presentations and maps exploring topics like the probable outcome of a second Russo-Georgian war, a full briefing on the people closest to Vladimir Putin, or an analysis on the feasibility of Russia's invasion plans for the Baltics, as well as a whole bunch of other recordings, well, you can do so by signing up on our Patreon today, the links of which will be in the description below. But for now, this episode on the Venezuelan elections and Essequibo is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Venezuela's Collapse: The Long Story of How Things Fell Apart by Carlos Lizarralde, for a look at how Venezuela arrived at the position it finds itself in today. The second is Beneath the United States, but a great look at how the US's Cold War policies have set the stage for the events of today. And the third is Crude Nation: How Oil Riches Ruin Venezuela by Raul Gallegos, for a closer look at the Venezuelan oil industry. I want to thank this week's guests, Kejal Vyas, Gisela Salim-Peyer, and Evan Ellis. All of you were absolutely great to have on the show this week, and I owe a double thanks to those of you who were happy to jump back on the phone and update some of the sections to include post-election information. I would also like to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers for this piece, them being Nick McNally, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Jonah Gunn. All I can say is thank the Lord I have a good set of Latin America experts on staff. I'd also like to thank Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Shankman, the production manager, Daniela Givella, Nate Ostilla, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Donlan-May, Perry Grace, Gabrielle Lane, Lorenz Van Kierbelk, Andrew Gundel, Isaac Gibbs, Andrew Garbery, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Sean Cottle-Lem. Our research assistants and writers: Jamie Tanner, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our host and analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Woolgarten from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. Once again, I can't thank this team enough. All up though, the Red Line will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.